The slap that broke a career she had spent years defying accountability, a career of misconduct unpunished, until one fateful moment when she slapped a well-dressed black man in a courtroom, not realizing he was the judge. What transpired next systematically dismantled her entire world. It was an event so sudden, so unexpected that no one was prepared. Not the bailiff, not the court reporter, not even the defendant waiting in the front row. Officer Tiffany Rourke had just entered courtroom 2B of the Franklin County Courthouse in Missouri. Her uniform was impeccable, her jaw set in its characteristic unyielding line. For a decade, she had cultivated a reputation as an authority figure nobody dared to cross. That morning, she was there to testify in a minor drug possession case but never made it to the witness stand. Her attention was captured by a sharply dressed black man near the witness box, speaking quietly with an attorney. Acting on pure impulse, she strode across the floor and struck him across the face. The sound was a sharp, percussive crack that reverberated through the hushed room. A collective gasp filled the air, followed by the rustle of papers and the soft clatter of a dropped pen. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as everyone froze in disbelief. The man didn't flinch. He didn't yell, lunge, or even raise a hand. He calmly adjusted his tie, brushed his cheek, and looked her straight in the eye. "I am Judge Antoine Kelly," he stated, his voice calm and deliberate, "and I am the presiding judge of this courtroom today." The silence that followed was no longer just shock. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. Every gaze in the room was fixed on Tiffany, who now looked utterly mortified. She blinked once, then twice, her mouth struggling to form words. The bailiff, unsure what to do, shifted nervously by the door. A young public defender instinctively reached for her phone, discreetly beginning to record, and others quickly followed. Within seconds, at least 4 phones were capturing the moment. Tiffany stammered, "I thought he wasn't supposed to be." But it was too late. Judge Kelly turned to the stunned courtroom and said, "We're taking a 10-minute recess," before walking into his chambers, his expression impassive. The room remained still. Tiffany stood frozen, the hand she'd used trembling slightly at her side. The prosecutor leaned in and whispered, "You just assaulted a judge." Tiffany stared at him, pale and disoriented, as if the ground had given way beneath her feet. A cascade of consequences. Word of the incident spread like wildfire. Reporters who were at the courthouse for an unrelated gang indictment case flooded the hallway. 2 local news outlets were alerted by interns who had left the courtroom in a state of shock. By noon, the unedited clip of a uniformed white cop striking a black judge in open court had gone viral. The title was straightforward: "Cop slaps a judge, doesn't know he's a judge." Initially, some viewers thought it was a staged fake, but the raw, chaotic authenticity of the video quickly dispelled any doubt. The public outcry was immediate and widespread. Lawyers, activists, and former defendants all came forward with their own stories. Some recognized Tiffany instantly, others knew her by reputation. Judge Kelly, meanwhile, maintained a dignified silence. He issued no public statement, did not appear on television, and made no threats of legal action. He simply sat at his desk, reviewing the docket for the rest of the day as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew a monumental shift had occurred, one from which there was no recovery. Before the slap, most people outside Franklin County had never heard of Tiffany Rourke. But within the police force, she was not merely known, she was feared. Her rise through the ranks had been alarmingly swift. Fresh out of the academy in her early 20s, she moved from patrol to narcotics to a specialized task force focused on high-risk neighborhoods. She earned medals, was featured in department newsletters, and spoke at police conferences. However, behind the public accolades and staged handshakes, there was a darker reality. It began with small acts of abuse. A young black driver ticketed for a broken taillight, a fine that was doubled for noncompliance. A Latina mother whose car was searched without cause, to whom Tiffany said, "You people should know better." Then came a more serious incident that almost reached the press. A video of Tiffany cursing at 2 black teenagers she accused of loitering. The clip mysteriously vanished after the boys were arrested for resisting. There were whispers in the locker rooms. Tiffany using slurs, threatening junior officers who didn't back her up. Every time a complaint was filed against her, Internal Affairs quietly labeled it "not sustained." She had friends in high places, including Chief Brandon, who called her a good cop in a hard world. The reckoning colleagues like Officer Sam Delaney saw the truth. After witnessing Tiffany slam a suspect's head against a cruiser, he was warned that if he filed a report he'd find his locker cleaned out by Monday. They all backed off, not out of agreement but out of fear. Tiffany wasn't an aberration. She was the system itself, the embodiment of power merged with prejudice and protected by a badge. Her downfall wasn't due to her actions alone, but the arrogance that came with believing she was untouchable. 6 months before the incident, a rookie officer named Jordan McLean filed a formal objection after witnessing Tiffany stop 6 black drivers in a single day, none of whom received a justified ticket. McLean was transferred to desk duty 2 weeks later, and Tiffany received a commendation. The problem was the very culture that allowed her to thrive. Yet cracks were beginning to form. Old complaints were resurfacing, and new leadership in internal affairs and the city council was less willing to sweep things under the rug. Unaware, Tiffany doubled down, telling colleagues, "They can't touch me." She didn't realize her power was not a shield but a ticking timer. When she struck Judge Kelly, that timer hit 0. When Judge Antoine Kelly returned to his chambers, he did not slam the door or yell. He simply sat down, took a deep breath, and calmly reached for his case files. He had been a judge for 12 years and had seen countless acts of disrespect, but this was different. This was public, undeniable physical assault. Yet he hadn't raised his voice or pulled rank, because he believed in consequences, not spectacle. His clerk, Monique, found him and offered to press charges. He simply said, "I want to see how they handle it. The whole system. Let's see if it's still allergic to accountability." By lunchtime, Judge Kelly's name was trending. People shared clips of a graduation speech he had given 2 years prior, quoting his words, "The law isn't a weapon, it's a tool and it belongs to everyone." But he made no statement. When asked by reporters if he would press charges, he responded, "I expect the same level of professionalism and accountability I've shown others for the past 12 years. It was a challenge veiled in calm. The final judgment inside the department, things were spiraling out of control. The chief's assistant left 3 messages on Tiffany's voicemail, and legal counsel made quiet inquiries to HR. Junior officers called in sick, wanting no part of the brewing storm. Kelly didn't have to push. The footage was doing all the work. That night his wife, Nadine, told him he should have had her escorted out in cuffs. "I wanted to," he admitted, "but it wouldn't fix anything." He then said, "This time she picked the wrong man in the wrong place at the exact right moment." The next morning, Tiffany Rourke was placed on administrative leave. The email from the department was vague, but the truth was already everywhere. The viral video was a match that lit a fire under years of misconduct. A 4-year-old grainy dashcam video of her yelling at a teenager reappeared online. This time, people weren't just watching. They were listening, and her badge no longer offered protection. The department descended into chaos. Officers whispered in hallways, and her former allies suddenly became unavailable. A memo from Internal Affairs requested interviews with anyone who had worked with Rourke, and over a dozen officers responded. Detective Naomi Brennan finally spoke out about the threat Tiffany had made 6 years ago, and a former cadet described her planting evidence. The floodgates were open, and the slap was just the beginning. Tiffany, in a desperate attempt to regain control, gave a shaky phone interview to a local conservative talk show, claiming the judge had looked threatening. The story didn't resonate. Even her usual defenders were silent. Her union lawyer dropped her, citing a conflict of interest, and her 19-year-old daughter sent her a single text, "Why would you do that, Mom?" Tiffany sat in her kitchen, her medals displayed above the fridge, feeling as though they no longer belonged to her. "He looked like a perp," she muttered, but she knew the truth. It wasn't about the judge. It was about her unchecked impulse. 2 days after the incident, the Franklin County Police Department held a press conference. The chief, flanked by legal counsel, stated, "We do not condone Officer Rourke's actions." There was no mention of her being a good cop. She watched from her living room, realizing the entire structure she had relied on was falling apart. The aftermath of silenced Tiffany, who once moved through the department like she owned it, now found herself avoided by her peers. Her iron grip on the precinct was gone, replaced by an awkward emptiness. The administrative leave dragged on, and her world shrank further. Her daughter, Avery, wouldn't return her texts. She tried calling, but the line went dead. Tiffany sat alone in her kitchen, the blinds half closed to avoid the camera van outside, with nothing but time and silence. She hadn't been charged, but the department was no longer her shield. Accusations continued to roll in. A civil rights group requested an independent review of every case she had handled in the last 5 years. Names came forward. Former suspects, officers, and even a retired judge. She went online and read the comments, a mix of anger and betrayal from people who had once been her friends. It was an erasure. Her voicemail was full of reporters and civil attorneys, but she returned none of the calls. The only place she felt safe was her car in the garage, where she would sit for hours, replaying old cases and telling herself it was all the judge's fault. But she couldn't change what had happened. She had slapped a sitting judge in open court and the world had seen it. The quiet rejection from her neighbor, Mrs. Beasley, felt worse than the headlines. Headlines fade, but being forgotten lingers. One night, scrolling through an old precinct photo, she saw herself, smirking and arrogant. She thought she looked powerful then, but now all she saw was a mask. Just when she thought she had hit rock bottom, a letter arrived, summoning her to a public hearing that would force her to face the man who had dismantled her legacy with his quiet dignity. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning at the Franklin County Municipal Assembly Hall. The location alone signaled its importance. When Tiffany arrived wearing a plain black suit and no badge, the room was already packed. Judge Antoine Kelly sat in the second row without a robe, looking calm and composed. He was there to witness, not to retaliate. Tiffany's new, reluctant lawyer whispered instructions she barely heard. A lesson in justice. The Civilian Review Board, a group of stern-faced community leaders, began the session. The chairwoman, Loretta Vaughn, clarified that this was not a trial, but a public examination of Officer Tiffany Rourke's conduct. Tiffany flinched at the phrase "continue serving," as if her career was not already over. They began by playing the courtroom footage. The slap, the silence, Judge Kelly's calm voice, it all echoed faintly in the hall. Next came the testimony. Officer Naomi Brennan read her statement about the threat Tiffany had made 6 years ago. 2 former arrestees described her name appearing on their paperwork despite her not being at the scene. Witness after witness spoke while Tiffany sat motionless, refusing to show a reaction. Near the end, Judge Kelly was called to the microphone. He brought no notes, simply stood, buttoned his jacket, and spoke. "I won't waste this board's time recapping what we all saw," he began. "What I want to address is what comes after accountability, because that's where the real work begins." He paused, then looked at Tiffany. "What happened that day in my courtroom wasn't fear. It wasn't a mistake. It was a reflex born from years of unchecked power." He concluded, "I'm not here to ruin someone's life. I'm here to remind this community what justice is supposed to look like, and what it should never look like again." He sat down to silence. Tiffany's lawyer made a few final pleas for leniency, but it was useless. The board took a brief recess before issuing their recommendation. Officer Tiffany Rourke was to be permanently removed from duty, her benefits revoked, and her conduct referred to the state attorney for further review. She stood there, numb, as the room emptied. People didn't look at her with fear or hatred, but with simple indifference, a feeling that hurt more than anything. Judge Kelly walked past her on his way out, not stopping or looking back. The truth had done the work for him. Weeks passed and the headlines faded. But in Franklin County, a real change had occurred. When Judge Antoine Kelly walked into his courtroom, people stood with a new kind of respect, not just for his title but for his character. A young public defender once asked him how he stayed so calm. He simply replied, "I didn't want to give her what she expected." That answer resonated. Officers started taking bias training seriously, and a community board was given real authority. Old case files were reviewed, opening a door that had been shut for years. Tiffany Rourke, meanwhile, vanished. She sold her house and moved away, taking a job in private security. There was no comeback, no redemption arc. She didn't lose everything overnight, but she lost the one thing that mattered most to her: control. In its place was a silence she could not bend. The moment Tiffany's hand struck Judge Kelly's face wasn't the end of a story. It was the public exposure of a private pattern. People were emboldened by what they saw. It was a town where things moved slowly, but the exposure rattled the community's habits. This wasn't a Hollywood story with a clean ending. It was the long, slow process of someone falling from a pedestal they built themselves, and the even slower work of others building something better in its place. The slap may fade, but the lesson, that power unchecked becomes poison and that real justice doesn't need to shout, would forever echo in that courtroom. If this story made you think, made you feel, or made you pause, subscribe to the channel. We tell the stories that others are too afraid to touch, with truth at the center.